All right, thank you, everyone. We're going to go ahead and move into the talk. So really excited to see everyone here today. Our agenda for today, we're going to talk a little bit about the goals for these talks. This is just our third month of doing the data talks, so we want to share a little bit about our process and what we're doing. We're going to talk a lot about students with disabilities, some different data and outcomes, ways that we can look at the data throughout Monterey County. And then we're going to have an introduction from the folks at Special Kids Connect. They're doing some really wonderful work supporting students with disabilities. So I want to give them a shout out and some time to introduce the work they're doing. Then we'll save some time at the end for a discussion and question and answer session. And we also have a short feedback form at the end just to get some thoughts about how we could improve these talks and make them even better. So in case you're not aware or familiar with Bright Futures, we're a cradle to career partnership, and we work with community organizations throughout Monterey County. We work in 7 different goal areas, and this goes all the way from early care through post-high school completion. So in all of these areas, we're working with students and we're working towards more equitable outcomes for all students. So a few goals for these talks. We have 3 different goals that we're hoping to achieve by having these monthly data talks. So the first 2 are about sharing data more with our community. These are analyses and data that we look at all the time, but we do not so much in terms of sharing it with the community. So we're hoping to get out there and make more folks aware of the data that's available and the outcomes for students. And doing that in a really in-depth way. So looking at multiple disaggregations and analyses and making sure that we're sharing those in an equitable way. And so part of that is through our data process, which we're calling the 5 A's of data equity. So the first one being accessibility. So making sure that the data is as easy to understand as possible, not making things overly complicated if they don't have to be. And then also presenting the information in both English and Spanish. We know that many folks in our community speak Spanish. So making the data and the information accessible. This data will also, the data and the information and the recording will be posted on our website after the talk. So making it accessible to many folks in the community. The next one is accountability. So that is related to how we take action when we see inequitable outcomes in the data, and then how we stay accountable for those actions. The next one is assets. So we're going to do some different bright spot analyses. So looking at districts or schools or communities of students that are doing particularly well given the circumstances and highlighting the assets of those groups of students. The next one is disaggregation. So it's a fancy way of saying we're going to break down the data and look at more than just the countywide average. We're going to look at rates by race and ethnicity, by income, by gender. Particularly for today, we're going to look at disaggregating many of these types of data by if students have disabilities or not. And then we're also taking a systemic view. So not just looking at students as individuals, but seeing them as part of the whole education system and moving towards systemic change to make outcomes more equitable for all students. All right, so with that, we're going to jump into the data for today. So the topic that we're talking about is students with disabilities. So this is a very broad topic, and it's something that we don't focus on quite as much at Bright Futures. We're focused mainly on racial equity for students. And so part of this process in the presentation today involved talking to some folks in the community who are doing this work and doing this research. So a few times I'm going to mention some analyses that were brought up by folks in the community and their interests in terms of looking at students with disabilities and their educational outcomes. And I also want to say that I'm still learning quite a lot about this. So many of you might be more experts than I am, and that we are at Bright Futures. So having that humility to say that we're still learning, but we hope that this data is informative for folks. So I'm going to go through kind of the data, the definitions of the data that I'm using, and give some considerations in terms of this data. So everything I'm going to present today is publicly available data from the California Department of Education. And so this is data that is entered into CalPADS by different LEAs. So some of it is going to be special education data that's specifically about the disabilities that students have on their IEPs, their age, ethnicity, things like that. But there's also ways that we can look at TK through 12 data from CDE and disaggregate it by if students have disabilities or not. But unfortunately for that data, we're not able to see the types of disabilities that students have. So there are some real considerations and limitations that we have to remember when we're looking at the data. I'll also point out that the special education data that we have, the most recent data is only from 2018 through 19 school year. So we don't have more recent data, particularly about special education. So you'll see I tried to make it clear which school year or academic year we're talking about when we look at the analyses. But that's also something to keep in mind, is that it's been hard to get data that's more updated. And then when we look at that data, we're going to see categories of disabilities. And this is referring to the primary disability in a student's IEP, so their individualized education program. So we recognize this is different than a medical diagnosis. This is not to say that this is an exhaustive number or percentage of the students in the county who are living with disabilities, but these are the services that they're being offered in the education system. So a little bit of a difference there in terms of the medical field versus this is education, special education specifically. Okay, so jumping in, we can look at the total number of students with disabilities in Monterey County over time. So this is based on annual enrollment data from the California Department of Ed. So you'll see I've put both the number of students who have an IEP and the percent of all students who have an IEP. So we see that over time, there are more students with disabilities in Monterey County. And the most recent data, we see about 12% of all students are classified as having a disability by CDE. So another way of looking at this, if we think of what does 12% really mean, if we had a group of about 25 students in Monterey County, that would mean that 3 of them are living with a disability. So that's another way of thinking about what is 12%. So this is the data, the special education data that's from 2018 through 19. And like I said, we're able to look at the different disability categories for this data. So I took each one of these categories and I divided by, the entire number of students in the county. So we're looking at what is the rate of each one of these disabilities compared to all students in the county. So if you added all of these together, you would get the 12% that we were talking about before. So we see that the largest group or the most common disability type is the specific learning disability group. It's followed by speech or language impairments, autism, other health impairments, and then so on and so forth. So these are the 13 different categories available on IEPs and the breakdown by these different groups. I will also say that the data is kind of presented in a weird way, and this is actually potentially an underrepresentation because some of the data is suppressed just because this data is given by ethnicity and disability. So for specific ethnicity groups that have a very few number of students, we're not able to see all of the data. So that's also a limitation of the way that they have the data presented. If you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer them after, but it's kind of a technicality of the data. Okay, so that was a lot of numbers and a lot of information. So let's think about what does this really mean? If we had 100 students with disabilities in Monterey County, 43 of them would have a specific learning disability, 23 would have a speech or language impairment, 10 would have an autism spectrum disorder, 9 would have another health impairment, 6 would have an intellectual disability, 2 are hard of hearing, 2 have an emotional disturbance, 1 has an orthopedic impairment, 1 has multiple disabilities. And then on average, if we look at 100 students within the county, less than 1 student would fall into these different categories. So deaf blindness, visual impairment, or traumatic brain injury tend to be the least common disabilities that we see. So I'm presenting this information again in Spanish, but I also want to point out that these are the primary disability categories given on IEPs. So it doesn't necessarily mean that students wouldn't have multiple of these disabilities, but that is the primary disability that is being assessed and is the student is receiving special education supports for that disability. So there's a little bit of nuance there in terms of how the data is reported. Okay, so another thing we can look at are younger students with disabilities. So in terms of the law, so we have this Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which requires children from 0 to 22 to be able to receive free and accessible education to support their learning. And so we can look at younger students as well. And this is just to say that there are fewer children that we see in the data that are in special education, but there are some children. So in 2018, there were about 387 children ages 0 to 3 in Monterey County that were in this category of receiving special education. So I also want to say that the majority of those students were 3 years old. So it was uncommon to see children younger than 3 as having a disability within the special education data. So mostly it seems like once students go into preschool, that's when they are receiving special education support. And there's also slightly different categories of disabilities, or slightly different distributions of where the students are falling into. So it's more prevalent to see speech or language impairments, students who are hard of hearing or have other health impairments at these younger ages. If you remember, the largest category that we saw was specific learning disabilities. And we actually see very few 0 to 3-year-olds in that category. So again, to say that those types of learning disabilities usually are occurring at a later age or being diagnosed or assessed at a later age. Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about disproportionality, because this is something that, again, we're working a lot for racial equity, and so this is something that we're particularly interested in looking at. So disproportionality is the overrepresentation of a specific race or ethnicity identified in one or more of 4 areas. So whether that be identification of a disability in general, identification of a specific race or ethnicity in a specific disability category, discipline, so that refers to suspensions and expulsions of students with disabilities, and then placement or environment. So that's on their IEP, where was the student placed? Was it into a special education classroom or into general education? And what was that kind of distribution between those two? Unfortunately, we don't have any data about placement at the county level. We have some information. Again, this is all based on the IDEA Act. And so we have some state level information, but we don't have county level information. So I'm not presenting anything about placement during this talk. So we can look at race and ethnicity overall. So again, this is based on all the annual enrollment data from this year, and just breaking down if students had disabilities or not. So we're not looking at specific disability categories. We're looking at all students aggregated together. And so we see here that, again, in Monterey County, it's about 12% of students. Statewide, it's about 13% of students. So similar rates to the state as a whole. And we also see that there's an overrepresentation of African-American students. So if we look at the number of African-American students with disabilities divided by the total number of African-American students, it's about 1 in every 5 students for this group of students. Also a slight overrepresentation for Native American students and white students compared to overall, and fewer Pacific Islander, Filipino, and Asian students. We also know that our largest group of students are Hispanic or Latino. So this 12% matches the 12% of the county. So another way of looking at this disproportionality is for a specific disability category. So here I'm looking at specific learning disabilities because that's the largest group of students with disabilities. And so I'm able to see data across all of the different race and ethnicity groups. For the most part, I will highlight that in a second. But we can see here, if we look at the different percentages of each student's group of students within the county. So for example, Hispanic students make up about 79% of all students in Monterey County. We're looking at the distribution there. Then we can look at what was the percent of students with specific learning disabilities within each one of these race and ethnicity categories. And here we see that Hispanic students, African-American students are overrepresented. So there is a higher percentage of those students who have specific learning disabilities according to their IEPs. And there are fewer white students in this group. I've also added these asterisks here, and that means that there's fewer than 11 students with disabilities who are Pacific Islander or Native American, and so we can't see the data is suppressed. So again, highlighting this disparity for Hispanic students and African American students. So another thing we can look at is discipline. So here I'm looking at suspension rates for all students in Monterey County. So these are students without disabilities, this darker bar here. We see that in Monterey County, the rate of unduplicated suspension. So that means that we're not double counting students if they were suspended more than once. So about 3% of all students were suspended at least once during the 2021 through 22 school year, and that's on par with the statewide rate. We'll also see that Hispanic or Latino students, again, they make up the largest group of our students. They're suspended, about 3% of those students were suspended. So if we look at students with disabilities next to students without disabilities, we see that almost across the board for the whole county and statewide, it's almost double for students with disabilities, this rate. We see that for Asian, Filipino, and Pacific Islander students, there were actually 0 students with disabilities who were suspended in those groups. But for many groups, students with disabilities were more likely to be suspended than their peers. So these were highest for Native American students, Hispanic or Latino students, white students, and multiracial students. There was this disparity in suspensions. I also want to point out that we can layer another way of looking at this, and we can look at gender as well. And I haven't made a graph for that, but I will say that male students with disabilities were suspended at about 6%. The rate was about 6% of those students. And female students with disabilities, it was only 2.5%. So again, we see that difference for male students that are more likely to be suspended. It also carries into students with disabilities. So we're seeing that similar trend. Okay, so another thing that this was very of interest to the folks that I talked to in the community who are doing this work is looking at students who are also learning English. And we know that this is a huge proportion of the students in Monterey County. Many of them are bilingual. Like I said, about 60% of students speak a language other than English. So we can look at students with disabilities with the added layer of if they're learning English or not. So this is data from the most recent academic year. Just based on enrollment, we have about 36% of students are currently designated as English learners. And so I'm going to use the term emergent bilingual as the same as English learners. And so we also know that mostly those students are Hispanic or Latino, and the large majority of them speak Spanish as their first language. We also can look to see what was the percent of those students who have a disability. So that comes out to about 16% of emergent bilingual students also have a disability. So again, if we look at the total percent of students in Monterey County who have a disability, that was 12%. So there is an overrepresentation of students who are learning English who have a disability. So if we turn this on its head, if we look at the flip side, we can look at students with disabilities who are learning English, and that's about half of students with disabilities. So it's kind of just a different way of looking at that proportion. So something that's of particular interest when we're talking about students who are learning English or coming in with multiple languages is their reclassification of fluent in English status. And so we can look at this data by actually all of the grades, but it's not assessed until 3rd grade. And so here I'm looking at a couple different age ranges or grade ranges here. And so if we look at students without disabilities, this is the trend or the percent of students who are learning English who reclassify as being fluent. So about a third of them by 5th grade have reclassified as fluent, all the way up to 86% by the end of 12th grade. So if we look at students with disabilities, we see that in each one of these grades, the rate of reclassification is lower. And by 12th grade, there's still more than 40% of students with disabilities who are learning English who have not reclassified as fluent. Another thing that I want to bring out here is that, and this group was 194 students. But something else we can think about is the proportion of students who have not reclassified who have a disability or not. So if we think about 4th graders, students with disabilities make up 12% of those students who have not reclassified. So it's the same proportion of all students in the county, just to say. And then if we look at 12th grade, those students with disabilities who did not reclassify make up 26% of all students in 12th grade who did not reclassify. So the proportion of the students who have a disability make up a greater percent of those students by 12th grade. So again, something in terms of equity to keep in mind, that we need to be supporting students with disabilities who are learning English to reclassify. So this is also a point where I want to shout out our next month data talk. So we're going to be talking all about students who are emergent bilingual or multilingual students. And so please join us for that conversation if this is of interest to you. Okay, so I have a few more outcome areas that we looked at for students with disabilities. So we looked also at high school completion rates. And so here I've graphed a few different ways that students with disabilities can complete high school. So the first one being obtaining a regular high school diploma. The next one being a SPED certificate or special education certificate, and then also GEDs. So if we put all of this data together, we get about 83% of students with disabilities are completing high school in Monterey County. And this was for 2021 through 22, which is the most recent data that we have. So one of the ways we can look at the high school diploma data, unfortunately, we can't look at the SPED certificate or the GED data in the same way, but we can disaggregate the data by race and ethnicity. So if we look at students with disabilities who are white, they're completing at 81% versus 72% for Hispanic or Latino students and 71% for African-American students. So again, some opportunity there to support students with disabilities of color to complete high school. For the other race and ethnicity groups, there were too few students to be able to report the data. So again, the data was suppressed for those groups of students. I also want to point out that the high school diploma, the graduation rate for all students in Monterey County for the same year was 89%. So again, another opportunity to support students with disabilities and know that we need to support those students to be performing at the same rate as their peers. So I looked also at college enrollment. So we get a really wonderful college going report from CDE. And if this is of interest to you, this was all the topic of last month's data talk. So go ahead and check out our website and everything is there if you're interested in college going rates. But for students with disabilities, about half of the students who completed high school enrolled in college within 16 months of completing. So almost all of the students went to California community colleges within 16 months. And so that's just to say that that was the first place that they enrolled. That's the way that the data and the report come out, but not to say that they didn't go on to a four-year institution. And I also want to point out that the statewide rate for all students attending college was 70%. So again, we're seeing that students with disabilities are not attending at the same rates as their peers. Okay, so another thing, obviously it's April and it's Autism Acceptance Month. So this was part of the reason I really wanted to present this talk during this month, is to highlight students with autism in the county and the data that we have. So a few facts first about autism in the US. We know about 1 in 36 children in the US is diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder, and that was based on data from the CDC that just came out this year. So I think the data was actually from 2020, but that's their projection. And then it's reported to occur in all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. I know there's been a lot of information out there and studies out there about underrepresentation of children of color being diagnosed with ASD. But this CDC report was really interesting, and they found actually there were similar rates of reporting in the most current data. And then we also know that the rates have increased over time in the US. So this was something I wanted to look at for Monterey County. So again, I took that data that we get, the special education data by disability category, and looked at the number of students that had autism as their primary disability and the rate of those students. So we're seeing that there's 3 times as many students as diagnosed with autism in the most recent data. So again, that's from 2018 through 19. So I'd be interested to see the newer data. Hopefully it will come out soon and we'll be able to see how these rates have changed in the most current data. So we can also look at disproportionality for autism. And here we're seeing that compared to the rates of all students, or the proportion of all students, we're seeing that fewer Hispanic students have autism on their IEP compared to white students, Asian students, students with multiple ethnicities, and African-American students. And again, unfortunately, we're not able to say anything about Pacific Islander or Native American students just due to too few numbers of students. Okay, so I'm just going to summarize the data we've talked about because I know that was a lot of information. So about 12% of students in Monterey County have a disability. In the most recent enrollment data, we saw that there was an overrepresentation of African-American, Native American, and white students with disabilities. We also know that about half, or 45% of students with disabilities are emergent bilingual students, so they're also learning English. We know that emergent bilingual students are about 30 percentage points less likely to reclassify by high school than students without disabilities. Students with disabilities are also twice as likely to be suspended than their peers. And about 83% of students with disabilities completed high school in 2022. In 2020, so again, that was the most recent college enrollment data that we have, but about half of the students who completed high school enrolled in college. And then in terms of autism, in 2018, there was an underrepresentation of Hispanic students with autism in our county. And we've also seen that the rate of autism has tripled between 2010 and 2018. So I want to highlight a couple places that I looked into that had some really encouraging data, some bright spots. So the first one that I looked at was reclassification rates for different school districts. So Soledad Unified had really encouraging data. And so again, I'm going to show the same data that we saw before, the reclassification rates for students without disabilities versus students with disabilities. And if we look at the data for Soledad Unified, the rates are even higher than students without disabilities. So we're seeing that there's some real growth in terms of designating students as fluent in English, especially before they enter high school. So 95% of the students with disabilities who are learning English have already been reclassified by the time they enter 9th grade. So really encouraging data coming out of Soledad. And so understanding a little bit more about how they're supporting students with disabilities and probably all of their students who are learning English to reclassify as fluent would be a good thing to look at.
Mallory, can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Sure.
I just want to shout out that Randy Banks has joined us this afternoon, and he's the superintendent at Soledad. So congratulations to you, Randy. That's awesome to see. And when we get to Q&A, Randy, I don't know if you would be open to any questions about how you're able to achieve that, but that's really fantastic work.
Thank you. Glad to, and I appreciate the presentation. It's been very informative. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. Okay, so a few more here. I looked also at high school completion and saw that 97% of the students who were completing at Salinas High completed in the most recent data. So again, that was compared to the overall rate of 83% for students with disabilities. So something going on at Salinas that's really supporting students to complete at higher rates. And then I also looked at college enrollment, and I saw that at Monterey Peninsula USD, about 56% of students with disabilities who completed high school enrolled in college. And so again, about 5 percentage points higher than that overall rate. So really encouraging things to see out of MPUSD. Okay, so like I said before, this is something that's newer to us, these analyses. And so I talked to a couple people in the community who are doing research or doing work with students with disabilities. And they had some really wonderful things to say. So I want to share a couple quotes from those folks, just to give some consideration and some context to the data that we're looking at. So one of the folks that I talked to was Dr. Kathy Draper Rodriguez, who's at CSUMB, and she does a lot of work on looking at disproportionality of students with disabilities. And something that stuck out that she said was that underrepresentation of students with disabilities can be just as problematic as overrepresentation. So realizing that we need to be identifying students who really need the supports for special education, and that it goes both ways. It's not just the problem with placing too many students into special education, but also not supporting students who could have benefited from special education. I also talked to Dr. Tara Kulkarni, and she also does work on disproportionality in students with disabilities. So something that stuck out that she said was that students with disabilities are affected by disproportionate rates of suspension, similar to students of color. Often students of color with disabilities are impacted the worst. And so that's something that I also saw. I looked at the rates of suspension for students with disabilities, and then also looked at those rates for Hispanic or Latino students with disabilities, and those rates were even higher. So remembering that this intersectionality is a really important thing, and that's why a lot of the data and analyses that we do, we're looking at multiple disaggregations to get to the true story rather than looking at rates as a whole. So I'm going to share a couple of quotes from Lori before I turn it over to her to share some more. But something that really stuck out in our conversation centered a lot around language, and that, again, the intersectionality between learning English and having a disability. And something she shared that actually someone on her team shared is that there's no word for autism in Triqui. So Triqui is an indigenous language that many folks in the community speak. And so not having a word to actually describe something that's a category in an IEP, you can understand why that would be difficult for a family to understand what was going on. So that really stuck out to me. Another thing that she said is that there's a legal mandate that an IEP be translated into a family's primary language, but there's nothing in the law about how quickly that must be done. So again, getting at that equity conversation of supporting families and students who primarily speak languages other than English. And I'm gonna send it over to Lori, because I think she also has some exciting information to share about this quote specifically. So please join me in welcoming Lori Luzader. She's from Special Kids Connect. So thank you, Lori.
Thank you. I want to share my screen here in just a minute, but I would like to address that last quote, because there is a bill in the Senate, I believe it's 455, that would, if passed, require that IEPs be translated within 30 days in a parent's language. So it looks like there's some changes potentially on the horizon. That does put, as Randy knows, will put a large burden on the schools if that passes, but it is something that would help a lot of our families that are disadvantaged by language. I also wanted to talk a little bit before, again, I want to share my screen here in just a second, but I wanted to address a couple things in the presentation. I noted that you had, because I was taking furious notes, it was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much. But I want to point a couple things out for those of you that aren't familiar with the education landscape or the early start landscape. So you had noted that there were 387 children between the ages of 0 and 3 in Monterey County with a disability. That's probably because that's what the schools are reporting. And the students with disabilities that are under age 3 are not served by their school district yet. So you might be seeing those statistics from MPUSD serves some early start students, as does the Monterey County Office of Education. So they might be reporting those students there. But in 2022, there were 480 480 students being served out of Early Start from the San Andreas Regional Center. So if you were to add those two numbers together, you would see a much larger number of students with delays, not necessarily disabilities, because the qualifications for Early Start are far less stringent. You don't have 13 categories. You just need to present a developmental delay significant enough to get services. And the other thing I wanted to make note of too is that we talked a lot about, the number of students with autism, and I think it is important to remember that the schools don't diagnose autism, that those students have qualified for services under the autism diagnosis, so to speak, but the schools haven't formally diagnosed those students as autism, and you might see students that have qualified for special education under another category that might actually have autism, and you might not see that in the data that you've pulled. So if it's okay, if I could share my screen for just a minute, I'd love to. It's disabled, so I need to.
Oh, okay. There we go.
Okay.
Is that better?
Yeah.
And thank you again, Lori. Those things are so great to know. And again, this is newer data for us to be understanding. And so I really appreciate all of the context that you bring.
Not a problem. So, I'm kind of a data nut myself, only when it comes to this topic, and particularly when I'm writing grants, because it's really powerful to be able to have this data in my back pocket. But let me just introduce Special Kids Connect to you. For those of you that aren't not familiar with us, we support individuals with disabilities and or developmental delays, their families and professionals throughout Monterey County. We have kids in our name, but we do serve individuals from birth through end of life in Monterey County. And we currently operate out of 4 locations. My office where I'm from here right now is in Monterey, and I have our education director, Jennifer Netness, with us here as well. We have an office inside the San Andreas Regional Center where we meet with families there. We have a satellite office location at the Greenfield Community Center on Saturdays, and we meet with families between 9 and noon on Saturdays. And we have a location, we are borrowing space from Monterey County SELPA, and we're there on Wednesdays in the afternoon. We also meet with families on a drop-in basis. We have drop-in hours on Tuesday afternoon, and we're available at the same phone number at all of these locations 5 days a week, actually 6 days a week, including Saturday. So we try to be as accessible as possible to families. We have a staff of 10, 8 speak English and Spanish, and 1 speaks English, Spanish, and Triqui. So we cover the landscape of services for families in 3 areas. We provide service navigation to families, and we provide that navigation in what we call generic services. So individuals that need support through, for example, in-home supportive services, they need financial support, they're looking for support through Medi-Cal or insurances. We are a family empowerment center in Monterey County, meaning that we provide support to school-aged children and their families, and we really support them to advocate for themselves and to be collaborative with the schools as much as possible, because we really believe that they'll get much more out of collaboration than trying to fight. And then last but not least, we provide a wide range of programs that support the need for socialization for individuals with disabilities in our community. We have a pretty content-rich website. All of our information and community events is on our website, and we have a resource directory there as well. We just did a big presentation to caretakers in Monterey County, or caregivers, excuse me, about the need for our families with disabilities, particularly our little ones in Monterey County. And it's important to remember that over half of our residents in Monterey County speak a language other than English, and nearly a third are not literate in any language. And we talked about Triqui a little bit ago. Triqui is not a written language. So families that are given any kind of paperwork in any kind of service environment, whether it's from the school, whether it's from the regional center, whether it's from the Department of Social Services, are not able to comprehend what they've been given. And if they're being asked to sign a document, they don't know what they're signing, and they have to rely on the trust of the person explaining it to them. COVID really prevented the identification of individuals or kiddos with disabilities at an early age. At one point during COVID, Early Start was seeing intakes at half of the number that they were seeing pre-COVID. If we aren't identifying, then we're not providing early intervention services, and we're seeing that impact right now in our schools with our little ones that are really facing some delays that could have been addressed and identified earlier. The lack of intervention access by our Hispanic families in Monterey County has been a key factor in underrepresentation in special education in kindergarten, and we're starting to see some overrepresentation by third grade. Our Hispanic families face a lot of cultural hurdles in wanting to receive early intervention services. And then there's a lot of geographic hurdles that they face, particularly when they're living in South County, and the San Andreas Regional Center could be a 2-hour bus ride away for them to meet with a service coordinator on early intervention services. The most common developmental delays we see in our little ones are speech and language delays. And we know for a fact that many of the families that we are serving right now have been told that the delays that the families noted when their child was 2 were overlooked or dismissed by pediatricians because there were multiple languages being spoken in that household. And there is mounting research that shows that having a child exposed to multiple languages does not result in a speech or language delay. And so we really help families get that services that they need, even when their pediatrician has indicated that there's probably not a problem. And then last but not least, this is national data. Delays are not being properly addressed for individuals of all ethnicities. When we look at autism, most of the time, autism can be apparent between the ages of 12 and 13 months of age, yet it's not diagnosed until children are 6, 8, and 9 years of age. And that is there's an ethnicity component there. We're seeing white children do get diagnosed at a much earlier age than children that are African American or Hispanic. I think you noted, Mallory, that 1 in 6 children in the United States has a developmental disability, and many of these disabilities, if they're not represented in the school level, may not be severe enough to require education services, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist in our community. And then we've addressed a lot of hurdles that our families are facing. Kids develop at different rates, we know that, but in the Hispanic community, this is often used as an excuse, and there is a lot of pressure on our young Hispanic parents from older parents to not seek support. We hear it time and time again, you know, my Uncle Carlos didn't speak until he was 13, your child's going to be just fine. Families don't understand the terminology. They don't understand the information that they're given. They're worried about their child being labeled with a disability, particularly in the Hispanic culture. There is a huge stigma against that. And then families are not good at advocating for themselves. If they make a phone call and no one calls them back, they don't follow up on it. And then we mentioned before that they, particularly in Monterey County, pediatricians may just write off a delay as being something that is attributed to the conditions in which the child is living. So I know that Laura talked in her chat, she asked, you know, where do we send children, or how do we help children get early intervention services? We always suggest that a family see their pediatrician, but it's important to know that when a child has an early delay, a medical referral is not a requirement for a child to get support. Referrals for children are based on age. If the child is under the age of 3, they can either be self-referred by a parent or another professional can refer them. Trumpet Behavioral Health does assessments for free for children and will make a determination whether or not that child qualifies for early start services through the San Andreas Regional Center, through MPUSD, or through the Monterey County Office of Education. Once the child hits the age of 3, then they're eligible for one or both of 2 options for services. One is the San Andreas Regional Center, and they provide support to individuals with profound disabilities if they're 3 years old, a determination is made whether that disability is going to affect that individual for the rest of their lives. If it doesn't look like, or if it's not conclusive, then the child may not qualify for services through the regional center right away, but could go back at a later date and reapply. But at the age of 3, the child should be referred to their district of residence, at which point the parents can ask for an assessment and be determined at that point whether or not they're eligible for early intervention services or for school district services through their child's district. But families can always reach out for us. We have Connect in our name for a reason. We do connect families with professionals and with resources in our community, and we guide a lot of families into pointing them into the right direction. We can sit with the family in a meeting with the San Andreas Regional Center, with their child's school, and we really, anybody that has any concern about a child or an adult for that matter is free to call us. So there you go, Mallory. Hopefully that helps. But we do recognize that there is a big need in our county, particularly for our Hispanic families. And we are blessed to have an individual who speaks Triqui on our staff, and she's really opened our eyes to the challenges of the Indigenous language community here in Monterey County.
Thank you, Lori. That's wonderful information. Thank you so much for sharing. I realize we're past time now, but we, Bright Futures team are welcome to stay on if there are additional questions about data. But otherwise, I will have Jeannie put in the chat our form for feedback about these data talks. So if you have a minute, please fill out the form before you head off of Zoom. But thank you so much again for joining us today. And thank you, Lori and Special Kids Connect team for supporting, and also to Tara and Kathy for supporting as well. So I hope you learned lots from the conversation today. I really appreciate you all being here.
We appreciate the work you put into this. This is amazing.
Yeah, all of this will be on the website later on. So if you go to our website, it's brightfuturesmc.org. You can see all the past data talks and the recordings there, and then you'll be able to see the slides and the data and the recording of today's talk as well. So if that's of interest, please visit our website. It's probably going to be up this evening, but by tomorrow or next week, absolutely the slides will be up there.
Super.
We also, just a quick, we put all the raw data there as well. So if anybody's into really digging deeper and maybe some of the analyses that we didn't present, that's available. And we're happy to, if there's somebody who wants to know, one of the things that we will do is customize it for a particular location. And so if you're interested in a particular high school or a particular district or something like that, if one of these analyses really stood out to you, we feel like it's much easier to act at a more localized level. And so if that's something that is of interest, please reach out. We're happy to support. Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, like Mallory said, we're happy to hang out for a few more minutes. And you can find the data, the slides, the recording, everything on our website, like Mallory said, hopefully within the next 48 hours or so. Any questions?
Hi, everyone. This is Alma Cervantes with Building Healthy Communities, Director of Education, Equity, and Justice, and I'm glad to see familiar faces here. I think more than a question, it's just to see and acknowledge the power of data, and the way that you all presented is very helpful. And it would be very interested to see some of the root causes of what the indicators of data from like the family's perspective. To go deeper in solutions, right? We are conducting a campaign across the county around special education directly from families impacted around these areas. using data and also listening to the stories, and then doing some training around knowing your rights. I think one of the areas that I saw across all the data that was presented, it was this culture shift about what exactly is special education. And then also the role of community and parents in regards to be the agents of change when it comes to really distribution of information, but also engagement in some of the solutions. And how do we prepare parents to know how to navigate this complexity of a system of knowing how to identify and support their children, but because a lot lands on their hands around like, how do they recognize their kids are in need of support, how to ask for a referral. It's in the responsibility of the family. So I think that's where one of the areas of focus that needs to happen of how do we build the capacity of parents and family to be prepared to confront the system that should be helping their kids in regards to find the supports that they need, specifically on students of color. There's a lot of culture barriers that exist that there has to still be addressed in order to get to decrease this percentage of students, especially with the Black and the Indigenous communities. How do we get that information directly to them in regards to what's available, but also how to navigate the system itself?
I will say, Alma, one thing to thank you for being here and thank you for your comments. I will say one thing that we're working on building. I know Tara had to jump off. Dr. Kulkarni, who was here, she had to jump off right at 4:45. But she is working on qualitative research with families who have an IEP and what that experience has been like, and kind of drawing out where there are places to make that interaction with the system a more supportive interaction. And one of the things that we were encouraging her to do, and actually, Lori, this was building on the conversation that we had going into this, was to include in her research Mexican Indigenous families, and to give something back. So we're helping her with finding people to participate and to give back by kind of exactly what you were talking about, Alma, like to the families, like what can we give back to be supportive. So that's one thing that we're just trying to build a stronger partnership with professors at CSUMB who are doing research in the community and making it a stronger connection, like a stronger give back to the community, not just a research thing, but what can we do to be supportive of families that are navigating these systems.
Thank you, Alma. Any other questions before we wrap up?
I did want to know, Eric, thank you for coming, Eric, from Gonzalez Unified, and would like to look at some customized data for their school district. So thank you, Eric. I got that message.
Absolutely. And that's something we're always happy to do, whether it be for students with disabilities or any other types of educational outcomes. So if you know someone or if you'd like some more data about anything in particular, feel free to reach out to us. I will put my email in the chat if you don't have it already. And feel free to email me at any time and ask, do you have this data already? Are we able to get this data? Are we able to do this analysis? We're always happy to answer those questions or do the analysis for you if you need some support. So thanks everyone for joining us today. I think this was a really wonderful conversation, and enjoy your evening. Have a great rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Randy.